thank you to everybody who's attended today as well, and to people who are joining us via Zoom throughout the state. And I think we've got people down on level 3 as well. So we've got our tribe scattered everywhere. And also thank you to the people who invited me to come and present today. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, and I think as part of that acknowledgement it's important to know the spaces that we're in. Here we are very close to the Brisbane River and very close to Meanjin Point, that elbow in the river up near QUT, where Indigenous people came to gather, to hunt and to talk and educate. Today I'm going to, I guess, lay a foundation where I'm going to be looking at the Australian curriculum and what guidance the Australian curriculum gives us in terms of reading and writing multimodal text, or viewing and composing multimodal text as well. I am going to talk about NAPLAN Online, and it seems like a good day to do that. And I would also like to talk about some research into digital online reading and writing, and draw on some work that's actually been done in classrooms with children, so we can see some of the future directions in that space. I'd like to acknowledge many people I've had the very good fortune of collaborating with over a number of years. I know it looks like a list of who's who, but it would certainly be remiss of me to not acknowledge the enormous contribution that they've made to my thinking around this issue. My co-collaborator Paolo Singh, Linda Willis from UQ, my Griffith colleagues Lisbeth and Sherilyn, and the team. We worked together on an ARC URL, and I noticed Kathy's here as well, with Alan and Annette, Karen Dooley and John and Michael and Vinesh. The work that's been supported by the Queensland Teachers Union, and of course the school communities who so generously allow researchers into their classroom spaces. Len Unsworth, also from ACU, and some colleagues from University of Wollongong, Lisa and Jessica, that I've written some teaching strategies with. Okay, I'd like to go back to Akara, because Akara is actually quite clear about the concepts of print and screen. And I think in so many ways the English curriculum was such a visionary document in the way that it paid attention to multimodal text. So we can see here that we've actually got a sub-strand that talks about concepts of print and screen, and it talks quite specifically about different conventions that apply to how text is presented on a screen or on a page as well. I won't go through the content descriptors for each year level, but I just wanted to lay that as the foundation. I also want to go back to Buckingham's work from 2006, where Buckingham was really quite deliberate in getting us to understand that just because something is online doesn't mean that it all operates in the same way. And so Buckingham provided us with, I guess, different understandings that digital texts may be one of a number of forms. And one of them might be a linear text. And we've got an example of a linear text here on your left-hand side, where we've got what used to be a print text that's actually produced in a digital format, but there's really nothing interactive about it. It's a Web 1 technology, and it really is a static print-based book that is simply presented within a digital medium. We've also got hyperlinked examples, again, Web 1 technology, and I call them Web 1 technology because it's the technology where the child is actually the consumer of the text. The child is the person who actually goes into that resource, and then the child consumes that text. What's really important about going into a text like the one I've got here on display, which is BTN, Behind the News, for people who are working in the middle years age group, that these texts have got so much hyperlinking within them that they actually create anything but a linear reading experience for young children. And I think that's the point you're going to hear me labour again and again today, that the reading experience between print and reading digital text actually requires a different skill base. So drawing on Don Liu's work from 2011, he talks about how engaging with hyperlinked texts like this includes reiterative cycles that might be seconds long or minutes long, these reiterative cycles that children are required to identify important questions and then decide when they're going to locate the information, critically evaluate the information, synthesize the information, and then decide how they're going to communicate the information. And that communication cycle may not happen with something explicit or overt. It might be an internalised communication process where they decide for themselves what they're going to do with that knowledge that they have found. I don't want to underestimate the serious intellectual work that happens when non-linear text has to be navigated and comprehended within that particular space. And those of us who have taught in the classroom will know what it feels like when we think we've set some really specific instructions around searching for something on the internet, and we carouse past the students and we say, "What are you doing there?" And the child looks at us and says, "I don't actually know. I don't know how I got here." Okay, so readers and viewers in this context, they enact a complex mix of cognitive, socio-cultural and physical knowledges and skills. These cognitive, socio-cultural and physical knowledges and skills are not mutually exclusive, nor are they linear. And Gunther Kress's work has been quite foundational in helping us with this thinking. In terms of the cognitive skills, the children need to, for example, decode the icons on the graphic interface, icons that themselves are a quite sophisticated semiotic device. In terms of socio-cultural knowledges, children have to make meaning of the context surrounding the text, such as the social and cultural context of production. And Maureen Walsh's work is quite instructive for us in this regard. That's actually becoming a bigger demand on children as the texts with which they're engaging are no longer coming from an environment that has direct alignment to their own socio-cultural base. When we actually allow the children to enter the World Wide Web, we know that they can end up in spaces where they've got to have serious regard for socio-cultural knowledges. There's also the physical skill, and Guy Merchant's work from 2015 has explored the physical skills that are required to navigate and interact with the text. For example, being able to swipe, tap or pinch a screen. It's actually quite a delicate skill. Do you remember the very first time you did it? And I remember the first time I tried to set a calendar on my phone. I couldn't actually get to the 5-minute intervals. They've also got to be able to scroll, highlight and click a mouse, whilst at the same time they're going through those cognitive and socio-cultural processes. The reading paths are also different. So when people talk about reading digital text is like reading on a screen, I'm going to say it's not. The reading paths are different, and we've got a lot of evidence here from Kress, Alison Simpson, Maureen Walsh and Jennifer Rossell's work. Now, traditional text, the reading path is laid out for the reader in sequence. It's actually very difficult to do anything but read a narrative in order, unless it's a choose your own adventure, but then it's still a very narrow choice of pathways. With digital multimodal text, the reading path is to be constructed by the reader. The reading actually becomes a very active process between the people who produce the text and the people who are consuming the text. And it must be deciphered across an increasingly sophisticated set of modes, and Lisbeth Kitson's work guides us to how very complicated it is when children are engaged with, for example, narratives in a digital interactive form. The third type of online text that Buckingham identifies is the interactive. And this is where we move from the Web 1 technology and we move into the Web 2 technology. I've got here a little screen grab from a child's blog site, a child's social blog site, not a school-based blog site, but a social blog site. And I wanted to talk about two forms of interactive text, and the first being around the topic of today, and that would probably be NAPLAN. We've had a lot of conversations around NAPLAN online. Is it the same as NAPLAN in the print form? And I think not. There's some examples there that I've pulled off the practice test items. We're certainly not privy to the actual test items, but if we have a look at the practice test items, There's 4 interesting examples that present themselves here. Now, I'll talk you through them because when you screen grab from the website, it's actually a lot of light blue and a lot of white, and it's very difficult to capture the screen grab there. But in this top example, oh, by the way, all of these examples are from Year 3. Okay, so these are from the first year of children who will enter NAPLAN. In this first one, I won't read you the exact sentence, I'll just give you an example. But there's 2 words missing within the sentence, and the children have a pull-down menu that they can choose for each of those blocks of words that are missing. So let's say the sentence said, the something sat on the something. Okay, there's 2 pull-down menus that children can access, and they've got to identify the word that would logically go into that space. But they can't pull down both menu items together. They can only pull them down one at a time. And they can only pull down the second one after they've pulled down the first one. So can you see the reiterative process there that a reader's got to go through to actually comprehend the demands of that particular NAPLAN task? Here's another one also from grade 3 where children have to click on the target word, and they're given 3 or 4 choices in a relatively short sentence, and they've got to click on the word to identify the one that they want to put into that sentence. This one down here was a table. It's an open table where on the left-hand side we've got some words, and the children have to identify if it's an object or an animal by ticking in the box. Now, this is a table that is somewhat different to the sorts of tables that we would scaffold children through when we're doing that very specific look at language features that go with a text like a table. For example, this one has no title, it has no column on the left-hand side, sorry, no subtitle on the column on the left-hand side, but it does have an instruction there. So when children come to a text like this that is incomplete, and it doesn't look like it looks in the rest of the world when they look at tables, children very well could be left wondering, how is it that they're supposed to engage with this text? They also have to be quite adept at using the cursor to be able to complete this reading exercise, and in this way a reading comprehension exercise very much becomes a reading comprehension and complete the text exercise. The fourth one I've got here is a punctuation exercise. So instead of just asking children to punctuate the sentence, we've actually got a single clause sentence, and after each major word is a box. But only one of those boxes would be the place where the children are required to put a comma. And so we've got a very different orthography attached to this sentence. It's a very different graphic layout for the way that children come to read sentences in real life, and yet the task is simply to put a comma in the correct space. So I'm going to stand by some of the judgments that I make about reading NAPLAN online is a very different enterprise to reading print-based text. And I'm drawing there on some work that I did with some Griffith colleagues, Elizabeth Kitson, Sherilyn Lennon and Paolo Singh, for a lit review that we wrote for Department of Education. Okay, so when a reader-viewer has to physically scroll through a text, comprehension is negatively implicated. And we talk about the importance of having an evidence base to some of the statements and decisions that we make around literacy education. And this particular statement comes from Cataleo's work and Oakhill's work back in 2000. And I think that was pretty convincing evidence. Learning and teaching practices need to help readers, viewers, to ameliorate this differential. So what's happening in the classroom space that we actually scaffold children around these physical, cognitive and socio-cultural demands of reading online texts? Here's the thesis statement. More than ever, reading viewing comprehension cannot be left to chance. Now, I did say that there were 2 forms of interactive text that Buckingham had identified. So the first one is NAPLAN, where the child is required to interact with the text to show how they read. This is the one that's probably more typical of children's everyday use and probably more typical of what's happening in classrooms as well. And that's where the children are using Web 2 ICTs to view and read text so that they can produce and write and compose text as well. And I'm drawing here on the Information and Communication Technology Capability Learning Continuum. I won't read what's there, that was just a screen grab. But it's also very useful to look at the Australian Curriculum English, which has some really useful statements in its rationale that indicate to us why we teach English language arts to young children. We teach English language arts so we can produce them as confident communicators and informed citizens. We teach English language arts so that they can build relationships with others, so that they become ethical, thoughtful, informed and active members of society. And I don't want you to lose that word active. That's going to become important in a moment. And we also want them to develop an understanding and develop certain attitudes and capabilities. When it's their turn to lead this country, they're able to do that well. Now, in terms of the curriculum, this is the ICT's curriculum. These are some of the requirements, and I usually find that teachers are quite surprised that so much is required so early within children's schooling. So typically by the end of year 2, students use class online discussion boards or blogs to read and post electronic messages. And if I had a class of teachers here, I would say, hand up if you're doing that in grade 2. And I can tell you my experiences are probably not enough. People are doing it. By the end of year 2, students are composing a message and sending it with support. And they're also understanding that a communication on a blog may be viewed later by other students. So they're actually understanding that those messages do stay in that cyberspace. They don't evaporate. Typically by the end of year 4, students are contributing to the content of a wiki. They're blogging and posting to bulletin boards. They're understanding differences in the characteristics, features and use of Skype compared with blogs or wikis. And I'm wondering there what happens with children getting access when they're on school sites and how they've actually got to power down when they come to school because they've actually got more advanced technologies at home. And there are some processes in place with systems of education that actually create a bit of a hurdle there for teachers to execute this curriculum. Also by the end of grade 4, they're keeping a journal or a blog on how their personal qualities have helped achieve a positive learning outcome, as an example. Now, by grade 5, quite simply, they are the wiki master or they are the blog master. They are actually making those really important political decisions about how communication gets structured, how it gets disseminated, and I think what we're entering into there is a very mature space for children to be writers and composers of multimodal text, just as they enter the middle years of schooling. I've got a visual here for you. I'll let you absorb that one. Kind of felt like a good day for a little bit of a break. While you're absorbing that one, okay, Prensky's work, very, very popular. Prensky coined the notion of digital natives, the whole idea because they're children, they're sort of born with digital technology at their fingertips. And we know that that notion of digital natives has been critiqued by some Australian researchers, Bennett, Matten and Curvin as well, quite some time ago, more than a decade ago. I think that's a message worth repeating because I think sometimes that whole notion that not all children are digital natives gets lost. And I think we've got to ask really important questions about who gets access to what sort of experiences and who then gets denied access to what sorts of experiences as well. We know from survey results from Hutchinson et al., and this is quite recent, that 4th and 5th grade students identified, the surveys were with 4th and 5th grade students, and the survey identified that students' skills with using the internet to answer a question are significantly weaker than their skills with using a computer, tablet or smartphone in general. And I think that sends a really important message to us as teachers. Just because children are busy on the technology doesn't mean that we should lose sight of what they're actually doing in terms of accessing and creating knowledge. We've also got some research from Colwell, Hunton-Barron and Renking that highlights students' ways of searching the internet that was really quite clumsy. Students didn't actually have an efficient way of undertaking that task. I still want to keep on this topic about what's the difference between traditional and digital texts. And I wanted to go into a virtual environment now, and I'm thinking here about the virtual environments that young children enter with Pocoyo's World, Club Penguin, if people are familiar with the penguin tribe, but also exploring fashion and fame, and in Woz World. There's many of them. But what I wanted to do was draw attention to the fact that in these virtual worlds, observations are made of an often uncoordinated use or absence of an avatar's gaze, facial expression, body posture, gesture, as well as the unclear prosemics and use of space. So what used to happen was the cartoons had, I guess, matured to such a level that we had a lot of this, what Kathy's researching around the grammar of emotion coming through in cartoons, where we were actually helping children to read the emotional dispositions of characters in cartoons. And now that the digital space has moved into these virtual worlds, we've actually lost a lot of the semiotics and facial expressions and postures. You know, the eyebrows and, you know, the furrowed brows and the turning of the head and all of those really delicate and nuanced interpersonal resources that actually help children to read emotion. So children who are spending a lot of time in these spaces are actually getting less access to the grammar of emotion. And I think that's got a really important message as we're helping children to come to understand the other. Do you remember the rationales I shared with you about being effective communicators and appreciating the other as well? That was from research work from Tan, Kay O'Halloran and Peter Wignall, and it was quite recent. The same group of researchers also found that avatars' oral presence was quite detached from their visual presence when participants' verbal utterances could be heard over the audio channel, but you couldn't actually see the avatar. The avatar was off screen, but you could hear their voices. And sometimes their facial expressions weren't discernible, or the speakers couldn't be seen. And I think for students to actually pick up on the interpersonal aspects of that dialogue, they've actually got to do a lot of inferencing about what body gestures and gestural literacies might have been a part of that communication. I'd like to review some projects. How am I going for time?
Good.
Good? Okay, I'd like to review some projects that I've been a part of. I first started looking at blogs in 2007, and at the time we thought we were just so cutting edge. And at that time they weren't called blogs, they were actually called MUDs, okay, multi-user domains. And this was a school, and I've just got the identity of the school disguised there, where a teacher who really wasn't on top of the digital technology himself, but he knew it was something the children were using. And so he was quite happy to set up a blog site and see what the children did with it. Okay, and I'll call him Martin. The school was actually getting ready to celebrate its centenary, and Martin had set the grade 7 children, because back then grade 7 was in primary school, the task of seeing if they could track down some of the past students who'd kind of scattered themselves all around the state and all around the country, and see what they could tell the current grade 7s about their time at the school. So Martin was doing a lot of thinking out loud about some of the decisions that he was making as a teacher. And I think that his utterances give us reason to pause and ponder about what we're doing with digital technology in the classroom. So Martin had some goals. He found that they were using their computers a lot for playing games. That's what they like, that's what they enjoy, and that's fine. But I'm also showing them that computers are a tool that they can use in other ways. Sound familiar? Martin believes in getting beyond pretend learning activities, preferring to negotiate authentic tasks that call for serious data collection, synthesis and analysis, and real opportunities for publication or presentation. And I think in some ways there Martin sets himself apart in the way that he believes about authentic learning. Something interesting about Martin's teacher identity. What happens to the teacher who is used to being the teacher who actually knows the content of the lesson? What happens to the teacher identity when the teacher is used to being the one in the classroom who finds the content really predictable? How does that shift in this space? Martin said, it was actually quite funny how he found this out. He said, other people can comment on your blog. I didn't know that until halfway through. It's funny how I found out. I started writing on my own blog, and one of the kids in my class had his password at home and saw my blog and his sister, who was in my first class the year I was at such and such school. She jumped on and replied to my blog. So I saw this reply on my blog and opened it up, and she gave me feedback on my blog. Once I showed it to them, the kids loved the feedback function and they took on the expert role and provided feedback. So I remember having a talk to Martin that he is still the expert in the class, but he's the expert of facilitating learning rather than the expert of the digital content. And Martin's dilemma, his epistemic dilemma about his role as a teacher, does he assess or doesn't he assess? The dilemma for me was how involved I should be. I decided not to edit any of their entries. I wanted to leave it as they're writing and something that is personal to them. I thought about sitting down and correcting their work and making sure it was correct before it went up, but I don't know. I thought it might be better for them to get up there and have a go, and they seemed to enjoy that. I didn't assess the blogs, but I believe the reflection helped them to understand change through time and thus contribute to their culminating task of representing changing times through a drama presentation and in the photo display at the school fete in terms of its centenary. So Martin's being quite clear here that he's seeing that the digital resource is a tool for learning rather than the accessible function of learning. So there are benefits of blogging. We can see that there was the potential to facilitate group interaction, which is actually a nice link back to the rationale of the English curriculum. We could see it was a very tactile experience for the students, which allows them to bring multiple modes of practice into their literacy learning. There was a facility there to store and retrieve constructed knowledge. And I don't make light of that because how often is some of the learning that happens in the classroom, some of the very best learning, ephemeral? It just disappears into the ether. And now we've got a way to actually archive these artefacts of knowing. Benefits of blogging, they can connect to the world beyond the immediate group, and we're experiencing the benefits of digital technology now with all of our colleagues in central Queensland and up north. There was a lot of group editing that went on. Kids all of a sudden started caring about editing. Doesn't that excite you? It excited me. Instead of the teacher telling the children what to edit, the children were telling each other what to edit. And a chance for students to rewind the teaching and learning. I wonder what we did yesterday, going back and having a look at it. And how often do we deny children the opportunity to rewind the teacher and go back and look where they get to choose the pace and sequencing of their learning? We allow them to do it in video games, but we don't allow them to do it in teaching. And I'm wondering if we should recalibrate that balance. Okay, so my next project was a science-inspired multi-literacies project. This was in 2010. And again, I worked with another teacher who she was probably about 10 years older than me, and she said, I did a science unit on marvellous microorganisms, and she said at the end, I said, so what? How have we made the world a better place? Where's the real life learning and all of that? So I said, well, why don't you have an inquiry question? An inquiry question that's got some moral dimension attached to it. That's not so much who's right and who's wrong, but allowing the children to take a position and have a position on scientific knowledge. So we came up with a negotiated inquiry, microorganisms good or bad, and I'll cut a long story short. The children had to decide whether they would support their knowledge to produce good in the world or their knowledge to produce Dr. Evil in the world. Something that required the children to take a moral position. The students formed teams. They decided what they would do with the knowledge that they thought that they had invented, and they had to produce a multimodal text. Back then it was a computer-generated cartoon called Cahoots, where you actually put the disc into the machine. And we set up a blog site. I went into the classroom. I gave them a 20-minute lesson on how to set up the blog site, and I've got to say back then the learning place was quite clunky and passwords changed every 3 weeks or something incredible like that. I set up an online forum. I spent 20 minutes teaching the children how to do it, and then we left it. We didn't do anything with it, and we wanted to see what the children did with it. At the end of the unit, these grade 3 and 4 students, who only had 2 Commodore 64s in the classroom, had produced 49 A4 pages of transcript. Grade 3 and grade 4 children, 49 pages of transcripts. Now, 147 of these posts were about the visits, who's going to vote for whom, and the Cahoots, and how do you get your character to stop levitating, how do you put them on the ground so they can walk properly, and those sorts of things. But 90 of these posts were about science. 90, in children's own time, they chose to blog about science because A, they had something to say, and B, they had somewhere to say it. I think that's important. So what I did was, being the researcher that I am, I was really interested in what sort of knowledges was being transferred through their science blogging. So I went back to Bybee's 5 phases of inquiry, which is what the Primary Connections was built on. And you probably know it really well: engagement, exploration, explanation, elaboration, and evaluation. And I mapped each of the children's posts to see what sort of scientific knowledge they were playing with here. And what we found was this graph. I'll just dissect the graph for you. So along the bottom we had the weeks of the unit, weeks 5 and 6. Can you guess what's happened there? School holidays. School holidays, really important. When something isn't happening in the classroom, children disengage. Okay, when the classroom loses momentum, children disengage. You can see here I've got a distribution scale along here, and I've colour-coded things, and I'll just talk to you about the colour codes. The light blue is engagement, and we had lots of that, and lots of that early, which you might expect in an inquiry unit. We had a moderate amount of exploration. We had a fair bit of explanation where the children had to explain themselves. And we had just a tiny bit of elaboration. But do you notice what's missing? Evaluation. Absolutely zero. When we leave children to their own devices, they never quite get there. And I think there's an important message there. Blogs will not do the higher order thinking work for you. You as the teacher have got to put on your listening ears, and you've got to think, how is it that I can make sure that there is some higher order thinking happening within this blogging space? A few other learnings was that 15 of the 19 students uploaded posts outside of school time. 15 of 19 students were engaged in science talk outside of school time. Is that a first? 60% of the posts were outside of school hours, and this really surprised us, as late as 9 p.m. and on weekends and before school. Okay, these kids aren't using what we would call the regular homework time. One female student who was really reserved in class was surprisingly active online in a STEM space. And there was an awful lot of student cooperation. The students were actually helping each other understand concepts. They were borrowing from the real World Wide Web, and they were saying, oh, well, you know that that experiment we did in class today, here's a YouTube video that slows it down for you or shows something like that. The children were actually providing the content back for the science lessons in the blog site. I'll just skip over this one. Oh, no, maybe I should do it. Okay, project 3. This is a child who set up her own blog site in 2012. And this is where blog sites didn't actually require HTML markup language. It's where blog sites became much more intuitive, but not so intuitive that even as a 12-year-old she could set it up herself. Okay, her mother had to set it up. Here are some of the reflections that she used EduBlogs because that was supported through the child's school, and it's really interesting about what schools will and won't open up for what sorts of reasons. The free blog had enough features to get started, but initially her blogs were very school-like. Do you know what they looked like? They actually looked like school recounts, the sorts of robotic posturing that goes around school-taught recount texts. And then there was one day when she realised she had an audience. There was one day she realised there were peeps out there. There was one day when she realised that it was her job to engage and entertain and actually earn her following as well. And her writing shifted in ways that it hadn't shifted when she was at school. It was a very serious commitment for one child, and if I have to give you one piece of advice, do not set up one blog per child. Set up one blog for the class. You can have different threads or forums within the one blog. The world map was very motivating because she could see who was reading her blog from which country, and that actually inspired her to understand more about that interglobal connectedness. And what was really important there was that it needed a community to support the blogging activity. Otherwise, it just becomes another school-like activity. Something else that I could observe from looking at this 12-year-old child's blog was that it didn't have a hierarchical or topic-based discussions. It's not like an information text where you've got a contents page at the front and you've got subheadings and there's a certain structure or scaffolding to the knowledge. She could select from automatic formatting options, and I also noticed that in the same way that young girls might change their fashion, she also changed her whole WordPress, which is something they seem to like to do. And her blog entries were usually short. They can either be written. She used personal videos, which are called vlogs, or photos, which are called vlogs, and audio tracks, and she could stretch them outwards into cyberspace by using hyperlinks to other stories and pictures and soundtracks that she wanted to bring in to actually complement the text that she was constructing. So a blog is a continual tour with a human guide whom blog consumers get to know, and people who came back and engaged with the blog post then actually became part of the interaction for subsequent blogs as well. To be considered powerful, a blogger does not necessarily have to have mastered powerful writing. Rather, it was the ideas that the blog users put forward. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and go back to some of the ways that writing has actually become something else rather than a controlled craft with the purpose of being powerful, and writing has become so robotic in terms of its generic structure that we've actually lost the focus on the ideas. And how much attention do we give to young children's development of ideas? Blog genre does not exist, and that is because the blog is the medium, it's not a genre. And so that means that a good blogger has to know how to command attention for the, let's go back to these words that we've known for so long: audience, purpose and context. Do you remember those words? Commanding attention is a function of breaking generic conventions, of also hybridising significant textual features, and that's something the Australian curriculum requires us to do from grade 6. And yet in grade 7 and grade 9 NAPLAN, we still see that unwavering commitment to a very elementary form of persuasive and narrative text. Attention-sustaining qualities are not accounted for in pedagogical strategies like modelling, joint construction and independent construction. So teachers who only teach writing through I do, we do, you do, actually will have to think about how they're going to shift their practice for digital writing and composing. I think what we found here challenges traditional and constructivist pedagogical models, and there lies a pedagogical dilemma that I don't think we've got an answer for in the current system. I'm glad I did that one. Okay, this is another one. This is the 4th project, and this was done in 2013. And I want to focus on what one 8-year-old boy who gave himself the pseudonym Bob the Great. This is what happens when you let children choose their pseudonyms. I think it tells us a lot, doesn't it? And this is what he did over 170 days, 8 years of age. He wrote, visually documented, designed and archived 65 blog posts. He added 150 photos and wrote approximately 11,500 words. 8 years of age, self-motivated to write his own blog post. Doesn't that make you weep? His shortest post was 80 words and the longest post was 354 words. Why? Because he had more to say. The posts were visited by over 1,000 viewers from around the world who were unknown to him, and he loved that. The written replies were provided on 187 occasions by a handful of external blog participants known to him, mainly grandparents. Gotta love those grandparents. Now, I want to talk about some of the knowledges that were constructed in his blog posts. About 80% of the blog posts were about his individual enhancement, his new forms of knowledge, or knowledge that was new to him that he wanted to share with other people because he thought other people need to know this stuff as well. So I'll give you an example. He was quite captivated by cathedral and magnetic termite mounds. And then when he was going across WA, they found termite mounds that looked a bit like this, and he couldn't work out what they were called. So he looked and he looked and he looked and he couldn't find anywhere to find out what these termite mounds are called or what their scientific structure was. So he said, out here the termite mounds are shaped like humongous cowpats. All things scientific need a scientific name. We called them Termitius cowpaticus. These mounds are particularly strong. Dad said he once tried to knock one over with a 4-wheel drive and it didn't budge, and he goes on to talk about these termite mounds. Okay, so the important point is about 80% of his posts were what was new knowledge to him he felt he wanted to share. 96% of the posts talked about social inclusion. And I think this is a really important point. Children like literacy learning to be a social activity. I'll say that again. Children like learning to be a social activity. Language is actually meant to be a social enterprise. Michael Halliday told us that a long time ago. And so 96% of his posts covered social networks, intellectual networks, and cultural networks as well. This is the one I want to focus on, political participation. 39% of his posts covered constructing and maintaining social order, and to a lesser extent, transforming social order. Thanks. 39% of these posts I've labelled as political participation. I think that's quite remarkable that a child is taking a social position for 39% of his posts. So I'll give you an example. Today, Dad and I went to the mighty Tolma Falls, and he very kindly spelt it out phonetically for people who didn't know that. And it was so awesome to see the tallest waterfall in the park. So much wildlife lives in and around the waterfalls, but unfortunately, we weren't allowed to swim there because it is sacred to the Aboriginals and 3 types of endangered species of bats. And he goes on to talk about the bats. I think there's a very strong statement there about his position around respecting custodians of land and respecting those groups of people who ask for some respect and not swim in certain places. On no occasion at all, ever, did any of the adults who was conversing with Bob the Great actually support or acknowledge his political position. And I think there's an important message there for how we as teachers interact with children, but also how we help the important adults in children's lives to interact with them. The adults who are interacting with him wanted to take the safe position. They wanted to talk about the cute things and the funny things. And not one occasion did they actually acknowledge the political position. Now, this is my last project. This is the project that I've done with Linda Willis from UQ. And we've actually moved ahead. You can actually see this has been a whole chronology through the technology, can't you? This is when we've moved into Seesaw land. Love Seesaw because it's an iPad icon-driven interface. And the very, very best thing is parents can sign up and anything that gets put into the class account pings to the parent's phone immediately. That's important because the other things that I've shown you, people have had to log into. The benefit with app-driven technology is it comes and finds you. And if you don't respond to it, it will come and remind you that you haven't responded to it as well. So here's the project we set up in a Year 2 class. We were very interested in taking social media into the very early years, mainly because people said you can't. So we thought, let's see what you can do. So the teacher was doing a unit on the creek at the bottom of the school, and they had an inspiration type wondering. You know, I wonder what my inquiry questions will be about the creek. And so you can see a lot of the pedagogical work that's happened there where the teacher's led a class-led discussion. She's harvested and archived the questions from the students. And there was a lot of conversations about what can be grouped together, okay? A lot of really important work happening in that grade 2 classroom. The children went out to lunch. This got pinged to the parent's phone. And when the children came back from lunch, okay, so I've disguised the text here so you can't see people's names. When they came back from lunch, their statement was, we are learning about Burpengary Creek and why it is important now and in the past. These are some of the questions we were wondering about. When they got back, 12 parents had accessed that inspiration map that they had drawn and indicated a love heart. You know, the little emoji love heart? Five adults had actually written comments back. Now, 4 of those adults were parents. One of those adults was a teacher, and you could probably have a really good guess at which one of those posts belonged to the teacher as well. This was really interesting. It told us how social media can actually be a tool of learning and take classroom learning into conversations with parents in real time. When the children got back to lunch, the teacher could pull this up and she could say, oh, we've got some more information about our inquiry. And the parents also told us when they picked the children up from school in the afternoon, the conversations in the car changed. No longer were the conversations, how was school? To which children usually reply, good. What did you learn today? Nothing. The parents could say, so you're doing a project on the creek. Did you know that such and such's grandma used to have the farm near the creek? And there was all of this wonderful extension of schoolwork going into the conversations after school. No longer were children given the burden of the responsibility to take school learning into the home space. And we thought that was a really important understanding around digital technology. Okay, so Web 2.0 put reading, viewing and writing, composing in transaction with one another. And my final slide, so new literacies for new times. If New Literacies and New Times had a Facebook account, their status would be, it's complicated. And that's it. Thank you.